Welcome to the Your Life, Your Brand podcast with myself, James Oliver. Please hit the follow or subscribe button. It would mean the absolute world to me. My guest this week is John Follis, famous as a Madison Avenue advertiser, although he spent the first 7 years of his career getting fired and the next 25 getting famous. After multiple terminations, he co-founded a Madison Avenue agency that within 4 years became one of the most well-known and award-winning in the country. And on a personal level, he was selected by the New York Ad Club as one of the 12 best on Madison Avenue. So let's dive right in. Thanks for coming on, John.
Oh, my pleasure, James. Glad to be here.
So without further ado, I'm really interested in how it all started for you. How did you get into the world of advertising?
In a word, it was very unplanned. I was not one of those people that, as a child, decided I always wanted to be an ad guy.
Who does?
Yeah, who does? Maybe a baseball player, football player, something like that. But I really did not know what field to pursue as a career. And it was only when one of my teachers pulled me aside and asked me what I wanted to do with my life. The course that I was taking from that instructor was a graphic design class. And I guess it was maybe 2/3 through the class where she pulled me aside after class and asked me that question because apparently she thought I had a lot of talent and that the school I was going to really didn't have very much of a curriculum for anyone who was creative. Certainly nothing in the visual arts to pursue. So I think she felt like she was doing me a service by essentially telling me to get out of that university and find another college or university that might have a more broad curriculum that would allow me to explore and develop my creative talent. So to answer your question, I guess that would be the start of it, because had she not said that, I don't know what I would have pursued. I took this instructor's advice and actually transferred to another university that, as she suggested, just had all kinds of creative paths to explore and follow. And that's where I got myself into a advertising curriculum at this new university.
So went through the kind of the university system, went through kind of your creative spell, found kind of your home, let's say, combining creativity in the advertising space. So did you then straight from university go and work on?
Well,
Madison
I should
Avenue?
say it was kind of a dubious start because I wasn't sure that advertising was the right fit for me. I had just transferred to this university that had a cornucopia of options ranging from, things I'd never even heard of, like industrial design, right? And architectural design, which I was familiar with, and fashion design and photography and photojournalism and illustration and cartooning and filmmaking. It was like being, it was almost overwhelming, the choices. So the problem for me was I was halfway through my college experience. I was starting my junior year. And a lot of those professional curriculums required a 4-year education. So I was kind of needing to catch up and didn't really have a lot of time to kind of dabble with the various options. And I decided before I started focusing on one direction, I met with someone who I thought was a guidance counselor to advise me. And then basically to just have a conversation and listen to my confusion and what I thought I might be good at, and maybe, helpfully guide me. He didn't really have a lot of patience for listening to me. He basically took out my card of courses where you fill in the courses for your curriculum that you're going to pursue. And he just took it out of my hand, took 3 or 4 minutes, filled it in, and then handed it back to me. I looked at it. It was like advertising 101, copywriting 101, strategies in advertising 102, photography, advertising photography, and everything was advertising. And I looked at him and I said, well, wait a second. This is all about advertising. He said, kid, if you have any creative talent and you want to make money, you go into advertising. Now take this card and hand it to the woman over there. And I said, okay. And so that's how I got involved in an advertising curriculum. And one of the first courses in that curriculum was Advertising 101. And I did so poorly in that class because I did not get along with the instructor. And this is one of the stories that I tell about in my True Stories video series. The instructor, with about maybe 3 weeks left to go in the class, pulled me aside. And this time when the instructor pulled me aside to talk to me after class, it was not positive. And he basically looked me in the eyes and said, "You just don't seem to get it. Your work is getting worse every week, and I'm going to give you a choice. The choice is either you drop the class because you're doing so badly, or you stick it out for the last three weeks and take the grade that I'm going to give you. And I'll give you a hint. That grade is not going to be good. I can't tell you what it is, but I'll tell you this, it's not going to be good. So that's your choice. Let me know what you want to do."
Wow.
Which was like a glass of cold water being thrown in my face, because once again, I'm more than halfway through my college experience thinking that this is the career that I'm going to pursue, or was the career that I was told I should pursue. And more than halfway through my first advertising class, I'm being informed these words are being told to me by this instructor who was from Madison Avenue. This guy was, the school that I was going to was upstate New York. And this guy used to fly up from New York City to teach his class. So, as far as we were concerned, he was a rock star. He was the voice of God when it came to advertising. So we took these guys pretty seriously for the most part. And I told him I needed to think about it. And he said, "I'll give you 24 hours. Let me know what you want to do." And as I was walking out the door, he said, "Let me tell you one more thing, kid. Do not go into advertising." And so that was a very dubious beginning to my advertising career, because at that point, I was being told by someone who obviously knew what the business was about, telling me that basically I'm flunking his class and don't go into advertising as a career. So I ended up, as much as I'm not a quitter about anything, the writing seemed to be on the wall that he was going to flunk me. After giving a lot of thought over Christmas break and doing a lot of soul searching, because I really didn't have a plan B. I didn't know what else to pursue. And I think there was a part of me that was very defiant, that thought he was wrong, that deep down I felt that I wasn't as bad as he was saying that I was, and decided to take the same course, different instructor, and see what might happen. That turned out to be a very good decision, because with that instructor, I did very well and continued my courses for the next couple of years and graduated with a very strong advertising portfolio. So that was a very big turning point. I could have, my advertising career nearly ended before it really started.
That's a very inspirational story, because so many people going through universities or even in business or jobs get told they're just not going to make it. And I think for you've obviously almost dug your heels in at that point and decided to double down and find a way to achieve something.
And it wasn't really easy. I have to tell you, it was a good thing that the Christmas break happened between that, because I had, 3.5 weeks to really give it a lot of thought. And there was a part of me that thought, well, this guy is from Madison Avenue. He's a very successful advertising guy. And this is why I decided to come to this school, because of instructors like him. And if he doesn't think that I'm going to be successful in the business, then maybe I should listen to the guy. So it wasn't by any means an easy decision. And I wasn't at all sure that even after making that decision, that it would work out for me.
For me, I suppose the next logical step to kind of understand is transitioning out from university and into the big wide world of advertising. So what was your first role?
I went to Syracuse University, which is about 5 hours north of New York City. And all the instructors, or I not say all of them, but a large percentage of the instructors were working professionals from New York City, Madison Avenue, that would actually fly up there and teach. It was almost like a training ground for graduating and moving to New York and trying to get a job in New York City. But I was so intimidated by New York City. I grew up about an hour and a half away in Connecticut. We had woods in our backyard and a pond across the street. And it was, but my little neighborhood was pretty countrified. The times that my dad would drive us to New York City was overwhelming. I mean, we were just assaulted by the energy and the activity and the noise, the intensity of New York City. And I was kind of a shy, introverted kid, and it just scared the crap out of me. So even in graduating college, the idea of moving to New York City was so intimidating to me that I decided there was no way I was going to go to New York. And then the question became, okay, well, then where do I go? And because one of my instructors, who was kind of a mentor to me, he had spent a big part of his career in Atlanta, Georgia. He still had a lot of friends and professional contacts in Atlanta. So when we were graduating and seeking the advice of people like him, the first thing he said was, well, you're crazy for not going to New York, but if you decide to go to Atlanta, I could help you out by giving you some names. So I knew nothing about Atlanta, Georgia, other than it was down south. I was ambitious enough, even though I wasn't ready for New York, I was ambitious enough to go anywhere else that I thought would give me a shot at getting into a good ad agency. And the fact that he was willing to give me names of people to talk to was all I needed to buy myself a plane ticket and fly down to Atlanta. And my first visit to Atlanta, since I didn't have any money, I booked myself a room in the downtown YMCA. I was a wide-eyed kid out of college. I was one of the only white people in this YMCA. Half of them looked like they were drug addicts or alcoholics. And I was paying my $12 a night for 4 or 5 days while I figured out where the ad agencies are and walked around town with my portfolio and tried to get some interviews with these people, all of whom said, so let me understand this. You just graduated Syracuse University. You're staying in Atlanta, the downtown YMCA, and you're looking for a job at my agency. Well, how about this? Why don't you decide whether or not you want to move to Atlanta and then give me a call and we'll talk some more. So they didn't really know what to make of me. I was kind of an oddball. I mean, no one graduated Syracuse from Syracuse University or anywhere up north and did not go to New York in the advertising profession. So I think they were kind of just scratching their heads, even though they were willing to give me an interview because, I was referred by a professional associate of theirs. So I ended up having to do what they suggested, which was to just pack up my bags, move down to Atlanta and find myself a place to live and then continue my search.
So over the past few days, I've been doing quite a bit of reading of articles and online and bits and bobs that you've sent me. And the first 7 years of your advertising career, you're employed, but you were managed to be fired 4 times in that period. Why do you think that was?
Couple reasons. I've obviously given it a lot of thought, having the benefit of hindsight. At the time, of course, I didn't really understand it. The first time it happened, I was being a wise ass. Now I can say that. The way it worked in this agency is that you would be given your assignment, which you would work on day and night sometimes for a week or two. After which there would be a big meeting. The senior executive creative director would have a big meeting with all the various groups. There'd be multiple groups, sometimes working on the same assignment, competing against one another. And you'd be in this big meeting with maybe 25 people, and groups of 4 or 5 people would then present their work in front of the entire group to the king, so to speak, to see if he would smile or not, or you say off with your head.
Jeez.
It was very medieval. It was very weird to me because I was not prepared for this corporate dynamic, this really high pressure corporate situation. I was presenting my work and the executive creative director was on his hands and knees. Oh, he told me he didn't like the size of the headline for the ad that I made. So he instructed me to go back to my office and print out 4 or 5 different size headlines. This is when things were done on paper. So he wanted me to create and print out multiple size headlines and return to this big meeting with all these people. And while he was judging my work, he would take all the various size headlines and basically physically put them over the headline, over the ad to see what size he liked better. I mean, I thought it was a joke that he wasn't judging like the thinking behind the ad. He was so unsure about this thing. I just thought it was like he was missing the whole point. Like, what did he think of the idea? What did he think of the words in the headline, not the freaking size of the headline? I mean, I just thought it was just such a idiotic thing to be so focused on. And he was there on his hands and knees, grabbing each of the various sides' headlines and laying them over one another. And I made a comment to one of my colleagues that he overheard. He basically looked up at me, and his face, he was an Irish guy, and his face turned red as a beet. He just blasted me in front of everyone, just blasted me because he heard this comment. And a few days later, I was kicked out of that group and moved into another group. So I became the black sheep of this other group. And not long after I had been in that group, that creative director, who was a pretty nice guy, pulled me aside and said, "Listen, John, I have some bad news for you. We're going to have to let you go because we're hiring a senior creative guy who is requiring a pretty big salary, and we can't afford to pay him and also pay you." That certainly was true, but the fact that I was the low man on the totem pole in that group, I think, was the other reason they had no problem getting rid of me. So that was the first time. And that's a long story, but two other times, I have to say, the person that hired me into that agency ended up leaving the agency within a couple of months after bringing me in. I'd be lying if I said that there was no relationship to the fact that the guy who hired me at the agency and then left the agency did not affect my being let go. I think it's a very it's almost like when a new president comes in to a government, he wants to get rid of the other people that were there and bring in his own people. So it's not uncommon in any kind of a business or political situation for people to be vulnerable if the guy that brings you in is no longer there. So that happened to me a couple of times. And the fourth time, I don't even remember. The overarching reason I would say, James, is that I never learned how to play the political game in a corporate environment. These were major New York agencies, and the politics there was intense. And if you don't learn how to work it pretty quickly, you're going to find yourself in a bad situation. And there were a lot of people there who I thought were much less talented than I was, who ended up doing quite well because of that very reason. They learned how to play the game much better than I ever learned it. And maybe it just wasn't a natural talent for me, but also it wasn't something that I thought I needed to learn. I always thought, and this was naive looking back, I always thought that it was all about being, if you're a creative person, all about your talent and your ability. And in a big agency, that's a lot less true than it might be at a smaller agency. In a big agency, your political skills are at least as important as your creative talent.
That's a bold statement, isn't it? And I guess I've seen that in the corporate ladder here as well, where it's about a face fits economy necessarily, rather than your talent in whatever the role it is. So piecing together the jigsaw, obviously you're in Atlanta and you ended up back up in New York. Was that during that 7-year span?
Atlanta was 2 years. I actually did not get fired. I had a couple of jobs, really one main job in Atlanta for a terrible agency that I really didn't want to work at. So I just couldn't find another job in Atlanta. I tried to get another job there. No one would give me an offer. So I ended up moving to Chicago, just quitting my job after a year and a half because I was still afraid of New York, but thought that Chicago might be the next level up. One of my college friends was working in Chicago, and she allowed me to stay a few days at her place while I walked around my portfolio in Chicago and tried to get some interest. And within 4 or 5 days of interviewing, I actually got 2 bites. I got not official job offers, but once again, they said, if you move here, we'd be very interested in talking to you about working at our agency. So that was very, very encouraging and enough to get me to move to Chicago and take one of those 2 jobs. And it was the job that I ended up taking that I ended up getting fired at about a year later. I had a second job that I actually did well in and ended up quitting to go to New York. So I spent about 3 years in Chicago working at 2 agencies. One I got fired at, one I ended up quitting to move to New York, again with no job. I just realized it's really hard to get a job if you're not living in the city because, it takes a while. I mean, Chicago was pretty fast. I mean, to get that interest in just a week was pretty amazing. And I thought the same thing would happen when I moved to New York. And after about 3 or 4 months, I still had not gotten any job offers. So I was really starting to freak out, wondering if I would ever get a job. And New York is the holy grail of advertising. So yeah, the bar is quite a bit higher in New York than it would be even in Chicago. But because I had done fairly well my last job in Chicago, I didn't expect that it would take more than 4 or 5 weeks to find work. And it ended up taking me, I think, close to 6 months to find a job.
So obviously working within the space, Madison Avenue, Chicago, Atlanta, you got a fair bit of experience under your belt. And then obviously eventually went off to set up on your own. What was the thought process for you to start Follis and Verdi?
Well, I guess getting fired the 4th time was probably the biggest beginning on my entrepreneurial path, because I was having such a tough time in the corporate environment. I began to wonder whether or not that advertising instructor who advised me not to go into advertising was right. I thought I still deep down believed in my talent. And that's when I began exploring, because I was having a hard time getting interviews, never mind job offers. So that's when I decided to kind of switch my approach, and rather than look for a staff job, let people know that I was interested in doing project work or freelance work. That was a little bit easier to get because it was a less of a commitment by any agency. Beside, it was often a way that a lot of agencies would try you out to see if you might be a good fit for a full-time job. So I started getting more and more freelance opportunities and having a fair amount of success with it. I did it for about 3 years and got a phone call during that period of time from a guy out of the blue who had been given my name as someone that he should talk to, because he was a new business guy, a business development guy, who had also had problems at big agencies and had decided that if he were to find a highly talented creative guy, then that would enable him to start pitching accounts as a team and maybe grow an agency. So that was kind of his agenda. When he called me, I didn't know who he was, and he had been highly referred to me by a guy who had been working with me independently for about 1.5 years and thought I was a very strong creative talent. So he was highly referred to me, but I knew nothing about him. And I suggested that we go for a beer and have a chat and see what he was, why he was calling me. And he explained to me what I just shared with you, that he was looking to pitch some business. And I showed him my portfolio, and he was very impressed with my work. And after about 20 minutes of talking, mentioned that maybe we should start an agency together, which was almost like going on a date with someone, and after 20 minutes of talking to them, having them tell you that maybe you should get married. Really 100%. the same thing. So I just kind of looked at him. I mean, I was intrigued with the notion, but I had not thought that far ahead. I was just, for the first time in my career, enjoying some success as an independent entrepreneur, getting projects and trying to juggle things so I could keep the projects coming in when one ended. That was always the challenge, because you would never be sure how long one would go. Sometimes they would say, we need you for a couple of days, and would go a couple of weeks, and you'd have to be looking for work while you were also working on a thing. So it was a challenge, but I was getting into some places that for the first time in my career really seemed to value my talent. The politics at smaller agencies was less prevalent. So it was more a matter of how talented I was. And I was getting some good work produced, which is not always the case when you come in to do freelance. Sometimes they give you the crap assignments, so you don't always get the plum assignments to do some good work. But anyway, I told this guy that I would be happy to explore collaboration with him. If he wanted to try to pitch some business, I would be more than happy to help him do that. And then we could, see how things unfolded. So that was the start of it. And for the first few months, we really didn't get anything worth getting excited about until one particular case where a business that was looking for a TV commercial, which is pretty exciting. Usually you would get crappy assignments like brochures and things like that, but never a TV commercial. So that was kind of an exciting thing. And when I asked him what the product was, he said, well, it's jam. I said, okay, that's interesting. He said, but it's a special kind of jam. It's supposed to be healthy. And I said, well, what do you mean healthy? He said, well, we're going to have a meeting with the guy who's going to tell us all about it. And I think you said you watched that story in my video series. So it's quite an interesting story, but we ended up winning. We were pitching against 5 other established ad agencies, and we were basically just a couple of guys. We were not an agency, although we gave the president of the company the impression that we did have an agency because he wanted to think that we were legitimate. But what he really cared about was a great idea. And we were shocked a month later to find out that the idea that we presented was the winner, and we got the account. And that account is what enabled us to officially begin as an ad agency.
Through my research and looking at different things, John, you've basically said you've advertised anything from Coke to God, which is obviously quite a big spectrum. What was your favorite campaign you've ever worked on?
One of them was what you just mentioned. I say God. In essence, I was selling God, but the client was actually one of the largest churches in New York City called the Marble Collegiate Church, which had been around New York since the 1800s. Interestingly enough, it was a church I was very familiar with because I was a member of it. When I first moved to New York, I didn't know anyone, but this church had a TV broadcast that would be in various markets around the country, including Chicago. So on Sunday mornings, when I was living in Chicago, flipping channels, I stumbled on a sermon given by the minister of this church and was pretty impressed. At the time, I guess you could say I was fairly religious, but I particularly liked this minister who I thought had a great sense of humor and was not really hardcore on the fire and brimstone version of the Bible. He was more about real people and true stories and inspirational things. He was a great storyteller, essentially. And I decided that when I moved to New York, I would check out this church. So I got involved with this church shortly after I moved to New York. And about 15 years into my involvement with the church, I found out that the church was looking to do, of all things, an advertising campaign, which is not normally something you would associate with any church. But this church, again, was a large New York City church. And the minister met with me and informed me that his chief financial officer had told him that he could spend $150,000 on marketing for the church. I pitched against at least one other person or agency and ended up winning the assignment. And what was presented to me as just one assignment for 3-month advertising campaign in New York, because it was so successful, ended up being a 16-year relationship with the church.
For me, I find it very interesting. To put some context to this question, is you started in, I believe, advertising 2 years before I was born. And ultimately, if you looked at the marketing landscape now compared to where it was in the 1980s, how much has changed versus how much has stayed the same?
Marketing landscape has changed incredibly because the internet was a game changer. I mean, the internet in 1994 was kind of like what TV was in 1952. When things went from radio to TV, it revolutionized the industry. And you could even argue that the internet did that in an even bigger way when that came on the scene. So it certainly changed the way advertising is done. It was less about advertising, more about things related to the internet, which it will always be about marketing. I'll say that, because marketing is the overall way that you try to get your product or service in front of an audience. But in the early days of the internet, it became about websites and banner ads. The cool thing to be in the mid 90s was not an advertising guy, but a website designer. a lot of people who were younger than me, who were just started in the business, who realized that, were able to make the switch if they had digital talents. I had no interest in doing that. I certainly valued what websites were. I started working on my own website in 1995 from the design architecture of it, and found some digital web designers to actually help create my first website, which went up in 1996. So I paid attention and respected the fact that the landscape was changing. But as you know, James, in the early 2000s, I guess 2006 is when social media became the thing. That's when kind of Facebook became a thing, and LinkedIn and Twitter and and YouTube and all those major social media platforms become popular. There's always going to be changes in the marketing landscape, but there are going to be things that never change. You're always going to have to be able to get your message across to your audience in a compelling way. And if it's not compelling, it's not going to get people to do anything. You ultimately want, if you have a product or service, you're ultimately going to want them to take some sort of action. So it's always going to be about exciting people. That was always my mantra with my agency when I started it, is get people excited. A lot of advertisers and people in the industry don't understand, because they think it's all about getting attention. It's only about getting attention, or now it's all about analytics and metrics. And they forget that there's an emotional component, that if you don't touch someone on an emotional level and get them to feel something, not just think something, but to feel something in their gut, it's not going to compel them to do anything. As long as you're dealing with human beings, you got to touch people not only on an intellectual level, but also, if you can, on a deeply emotional level.
100% agree with you there. You've always got to touch someone on an emotional level. And I believe it's storytelling, not selling, is the way forward. So obviously, reading articles, you've published a lot over the years, but one stuck out to me, and it was in Adweek, where you coined the phrase G-cred. Do you still believe that's the case? Or has it now shifted to S-cred for social credibility?
Right. So in case anyone's wondering what you're talking about, the G in G-cred stands for Google. And this article was published in early 2007, but I was using the term in 2005, 2006, just because I thought it was a very simple way of expressing a very big idea: Google credibility. Again, 2005 and 6 is when Google became the big thing on the internet. And more people started realizing, certainly I started realizing, that no matter who you are, certainly if you're marketing a product or service, you absolutely have to be found on Google. But not just if you're running a business that markets a product or service. Even if you're a professional person, I was reading books about the idea of personal branding. If you want to be a leader in your industry, you have to almost look at yourself as if you're a product and figure out how you would market yourself as a product. Now, obviously, you're not going to be, doing TV commercials or radio commercials about yourself, but you've got to think of other ways to market yourself that are going to help people, first of all, know who you are and what you stand for, especially in the entrepreneurial arena, less so in the corporate environment. As anyone who is a business owner, I think, has to pay attention to the idea of a personal brand. And again, you don't even have to be a business owner. You could be in the medical field, or you could be in any profession. If you want to stand out in your profession as a thought leader, you have to start thinking about the actions you can take about helping to brand yourself, to get more opportunities to share your knowledge and experience, whether it be a TED Talk or writing an article or whatever. We could get into that whole idea of a personal brand, but the question you asked me was about G-cred, and do I still think it's important, or has S-cred, social media, taken over? Well, that's a good question. Every year, social media, I remember when social media just started and people just didn't take it that seriously. Certainly people in my profession and the traditional advertising world didn't take it seriously because it was just at the, the very early stages of it. I still think that when people are looking for products and services, they're still going to go to Google. I mean, I think the most used website in the universe is still Google. And until that no longer becomes the case, and I suppose at some time that something else will replace it. I don't know what or when. I think Google will be here still for quite a while. Google will still be the most important cred to kind of have, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive either. I mean, the more you're active in these other platforms, you Google anyone, and chances are the first thing that's going to come up about them is their LinkedIn profile. If they've pimped it out well enough, that's going to be the way that they're going to be identified. But if they're also active in the other social media platforms, that is only going to add to their ultimate G cred. So I think social media is probably a huge subset of G cred.
So they coexist together and both help each other to help someone grow their brand, whether it be personal or business.
I think it's like marketing and advertising. I think what Google is to social media is what marketing is to advertising.
One of my final questions, obviously we've covered quite a lot of ground in this, and from being told to drop out of university, from being fired from jobs and being told you'll never make it in the advertising business, to sitting where you are today, worked on some huge campaigns. What was the most important lesson you learned throughout your career in advertising? What would you say to yourself if you could go back now and give that lesson to yourself?
At the risk of sounding corny, looking back, I would have never had a career in advertising, as I mentioned, had I listened to the advice of that instructor. The quote that I had in my high school yearbook was, "Where there's a will, there's a way." Even though I came up with that when I was 18 for my high school yearbook, because that's what you do when you have a yearbook, you have to come up with a quote. At least in the US, that's one of the requirements. At least it was when I was in high school. I still think it's a good quote that applies to anyone in any situation. I think if you want something bad enough, you can succeed. If anyone has proven that to be true in their career, I certainly have with my career in advertising.
So I will put a link in the show notes for everyone to access the true stories and to find out more about John. But where can my listeners find you online?
Well, I couldn't be considered a legitimate interview for you if I didn't have you reference my creation of G cred without answering that question by saying, just Google me.